Dobry wieczór. Dziś bardzo kameralnie.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The weather today is actually quite bad, so that's why the group here present is not so numerous. But anyway, I believe the atmosphere is really nice for us to meet, together with Anne Barlow, the director of Tate St Ives, within the cycle Curating Institutions, today carried out in cooperation with the British Council as the part of the Creativity Talks program. I would like to shortly introduce our guest. Anne Barlow is the director of Tate St Ives since 2017, and before that, for over a decade, she was a curator in New York New Museum, and she was also the director of the New York Art in General. So Anne is also curator of many exhibitions, many projects, Latvian Pavilion at the 55th Biennale in Venice. She's also published many books. She's an author of numerous texts, and today she is going to focus on the incredibly interesting context in which she works in Tate St Ives. St Ives, as we're going to see in a moment in the presentation, is a very tiny town in the southwest of Great Britain in Cornwall. It used to be a fisherman village. Now people spend their holidays there. And one of Tate's museums is located there in St Ives. So this very international, ambitious program can be carried out or presented together with the local community, how they managed to convince the local community for supporting Tate St Ives, and we will also know how this institution became internationally important. This will be the topic of our talk, because it's not only presentation. I think that after a presentation we'll have a Q&A session.
And sorry, after this short introduction, the floor is yours, and also the conversation after, which in this very small, intimate group, I think it would even go better.
Thank you. Do I need to use this? Yes. Do I need to use that? Okay. Okay, all right. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you to everyone coming on the rainy, grey night for the talk. So what I want to do is just give a brief introduction to how we call it the new Tate St Ives, because it has expanded a couple of years ago. And I was asked to focus on the process of its development with a particular focus on our relationship to where we are, to the relationship with the community, which means the community as in the general public, but also the community of artists and other people who are living in and around the town, because it's quite a specific context. So, and then I'll talk a little bit about the new program and how we continue to navigate all of the usual challenges between local and international artists in the region, artists internationally, encouraging debate and dialogue and so on. So first of all, I'm going to show you this rather spectacular view of our aerial photo of Tate St Ives. And essentially, the area with the drum shape, that is the original building. So the white part is the original building, and the new part is the piece you can see behind with the 6 rectangles. So that's the whole new gallery with the loading bay in grey, just at the car park side. So it's literally, it's a doubling in size. And I can take you through that building in more depth in a few moments. But I wanted to first, of course, take us back to where we are. And as you can see, we're right at the ends of the earth in England. And we are right at the end of that little tip. So It is a very isolated, very rural, and very remote part of the UK. And I went there after New York City. So believe me, I experienced the difference. So it is, of course, famous for Barbara Hepworth, Ben Nicholson, and an artist like Nam Gabo, who came to St Ives with the outbreak of the war in 1939. Several of them had been living in London. And then when there was a threat of bombing, they, of course, moved outside of the city centre. So St Ives became this real, and unlikely in some ways because it's not a metropolitan centre, but not in others because it acts as a kind of refuge. And it also has a history of artists coming to it from the time of J.M.W. Turner to paint landscapes and the most amazing kind of scenes, because the quality of light is really quite incredible. I don't think I've experienced light like it, possibly like south of France or other places, but it has a particular quality because it's so exposed. It gets light from, you know, all around essentially. So there's another quite endearing graphic that's in one of our rooms that shows that St Ives really has had a whole international life and continues to have that. So it's a very dynamic relationship. And in the early 20th century, this, of course, was primarily with Europe and America. Europe, first of all, because artists like Ben Nicholson, Barbara Hepworth, and Gabo were in, Paris. They met there. They were part of different groups there. But this also shows in the larger map over there, which is a little bit hard to see, that someone like Barbara Hepworth never imagined that she would go to St Ives and live there till she died in the 1970s. This perhaps wasn't necessarily something that was imagined, but now we have the Barbara Hepworth Museum, and it's precisely because as an artist she could live there and work and have ultimate focus, and at the same time be showing in Sao Paulo and in Venice Biennale, and then go back to this incredible place where she could just really focus on making work. And that is the characteristic that still attracts artists today, because it really has that quality. Today, of course, the relationships are truly global. We also have a place called Porthmeor Studios that's not connected to Tate, but it's a place where a lot of artists come and do residencies, and the views are just like a huge window looking right out onto the ocean, and it's the most incredible place for artists to work. And there are also another number of arts institutions in Cornwall and more residency programs, so there's quite a lot happening in the region. But after Tate St Ives opened in 1993 to celebrate that modernist legacy, essentially, they anticipated that around 90,000 people would come, and over 200,000 people came. So they couldn't fit them in the building. Like, it literally became a problem very, very soon after it opened. So by the time it got to the early to mid 2000s, it was decided that they would expand. Don't necessarily always talk about this, but I was asked to bring it, and I think it's actually quite interesting because this was the immediate reaction to our plans. I wasn't there at the time, but learning about the history of Tate St Ives' development is quite fascinating because it actually is the result of a community relationship that went very badly wrong in the beginning. And I think that's not necessarily something museums usually experience, so it's an interesting, case study. But they really felt that Tate was an institution that seemed to lack the appropriate sensitivities when dealing with issues that were very important to a very small town of only around 11,000 people. So this is a place where you really feel what it means to be local, as well as remote and rural, and where every decision you make has immediate impact, and you will hear about it in terms of whether people love it or if they don't love it. It's a very transparent relationship in a sense. So in this case, the project really became as much about how Tate St Ives began to work with people as it was about a new building. So in a way, it was almost more about that. So they began a very interesting thing. They actually started to openly consult with the community itself. And my former director, Mark Osterfield, has these wonderful stories about, a bit like tonight, but much more rainy, with horizontal rain, lonely in a caravan on a hill, meeting every resident one by one and hearing their complaints and their wishes and desires. And this literally went on for months. And this is how they began, because there was so much resistance, people wouldn't even have a meeting with Tate. So, and it's not necessarily something Tate usually experiences, so this was a really interesting thing. And they really did discuss alternative plans for the building. So at these meetings, they would also show them different ideas for designs. And the public doesn't usually get consulted about how a museum building is going to look, at least not on that level. So that resulted in the creation of a community liaison group, which still meets. In fact, it meets 5 times a year. We just had another meeting last week, and it's very much still part of our lives. And we ended up with a community brief that outlined the needs of the town, the wishes of the town in terms of what they wanted. And essentially what they wanted was for Tate St Ives to work with the landscape and not build another huge building on top of the hill, because if you remember this view, it's already the biggest building in the town, this white building. So if you can imagine that there would be another huge building next to that, and it would dwarf the actual town and the landscape. In fact, we created something entirely different. But essentially, this expansion was supposed to allow us to show the modernist artists, with the reason St Ives and Tate St Ives became well known. But they also expected to see the kind of level of ambitious international exhibitions that Tate centrally, of course, has become known for. So, which is not necessarily an easy brief. So I wanted just to show you the exterior of the building. This is it when I come to work every day, that's what I see. So the one on the top left, that the staff entrance is just there. Another view of it here, where they had kind of wild planting and so on. And Jamie Faubert is the appointed architect, and he is now designing the new National Portrait Gallery extension in London. And this was one of the projects that they looked at when they were thinking about him as an architect. And I think what he's done beautifully is think really sensitively about site. So you've got the wild planting, which is very much like the graveyard, the wildness around the actual building. The light comes in from the top. So essentially our gallery is a hole built inside a hill. And it took years to dig out the multiple tons of rock to create this gallery. So let me show you. So it literally doubled. It added around 600 square meters of galleries. It allowed us to have new learning spaces. And I'll just take you through a couple of these images. So you can see now how the only really visible part is the loading bay and the top of the galleries there. This is a view of the original gallery here, and then the new gallery on the right. This is a better image of how you actually might experience this in a section. And this is just to give you an idea of the plan. So essentially 5 and 6, those are the new galleries. So 5 is kind of like an ante-room gallery, and 6, it's huge. So it's made a massive difference to what we can do. But it wasn't just the building that the residents or community helped to shape. Over the last 4 to 5 years before the building opened, with the support of the Heritage Lottery Fund grant, Tate St Ives actually consulted a lot of different groups about the content of the St Ives and modernist displays, which again I think is not necessarily that common, where you actually start consulting audiences about what you might even put on show and how you're going to show it. And I think the questions and the comments, I would say, didn't inform necessarily every work that was on show, but it informed perhaps a philosophy or perhaps an approach to how they might tell the multiple narratives that are around modern art in St Ives. And this is just a picture. This is a picture of the existing building with the modernist collection, which, as you can see, has its own character. It is a building that was very suited to works of art this scale and size. It was designed for works such as this. But this kind of consultation actually brings to mind something that happened in my former role at Art in General in New York, where we had a symposium called The Politics of Listening. And this symposium examined the idea of listening as a political act, a pedagogical process, and a protocol for engagement. And a keynote was given by artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan, and it began with a scientific analysis of hearing and listening and the difference between these. And then it moved into perspectives on listening that were informed by diverse social, cultural, technological, and spatial considerations. In summary, the symposium considered how one can genuinely listen with agency and intent, noting the shortfalls of many well-intentioned art projects that aim to engage individuals or communities, but that lack the flexibility to respond in meaningful ways. One of the artists and educators, Pablo Helguera, noted that listening is irrelevant if what has been listened to is not assimilated into the very structure of the work. So essentially what I'm referring back to in that is that this is a very unusual situation where they did listen and they really heard, and then they adopted the kinds of feedback into the design of the building. But in this sense, I think we ended up possibly with a better outcome than we might have had he followed the original plan. Let me see. But of course, the relationships with community don't stop when you open a building. That begins a whole new phase of interaction, of communication and dialogue, agreement, potential disagreement, debate, and it is a very live relationship when any internal or external factor might change the nature of that relationship at any time. So unlike possibly being in New York City where you're part of an enormous metropolis essentially, you can be part of different groups, certain sectors, you're part of a small nonprofit, you're part of an independent museum, and you have your different networks, but you might not feel, perhaps unless you're in Brooklyn or a smaller, an area where there's a smaller number of arts institutions close around you in a more community way, Bronx possibly, that you're really part of a community of everyday people. I think that's actually quite hard to feel in a city like that, and here you really feel it. So to give a context for the work, I'm just going to put up Tate's new vision, which was just launched this year by Maria Balshaw, who's our new director. And as you can see, Tate overall is to serve as artistically adventurous and culturally inclusive art museums for the UK and the world that are open, bold, rigorous, and kind in all that we do. So we've actually adopted values as part of our mission statement for the very first time. And it is actually a really useful thing to remember and think about when you are programming, because what does it mean to be open? What does it mean to be bold? I think we all know what it means to be rigorous, but what does it mean to be kind? And that means, in a sense, to each other, to our audiences, to artists, what does that literally mean in all that we do? So ours is slightly adapted. That is our primary vision. And the secondary vision, if you like, is to be a valued part of Cornwall, because that's where we are, offering life-changing experiences through an ambitious and internationally recognized program. So you'll notice that local and regional is first, because that's where we are, but second is the ambitious and internationally recognized program, because it doesn't mean you have to be less ambitious just because you're in a place that's far away from everything else. It actually brought to mind a conference that at CMAM a couple of years ago, when the key question addressed in it was the roles and responsibilities of museums in civil society. And I think it's a really important question in terms of considering how to present ambitious international exhibitions alongside a critical program that also engages audiences in a rural and remote region, but is also still relevant for contemporary art debates globally. So this, I think, is a particularly unique and interesting challenge. In our case, some of the biggest challenges are around connectivity, geography, transport, economic deprivation, a non-diverse community, and barriers to education. While we are situated in St Ives and receive an increasing number of national and international visitors, it is important to remember that Cornwall is the second poorest region in Northern Europe, which might surprise some of you, because St Ives looks very pretty, but as soon as you step outside, Cornwall is very different. And that's only second to West Wales in the UK. And for those who do work, the average wage is around £14,300. So you're looking at a really kind of a socioeconomic situation that is really very challenging. Unemployment is extremely high, and yet you have a Tate there. You have a Tate in this region programming in a particular way, and your, I guess your relevance and your importance has to be looked at in a different way. So the questions that we continue to grapple with are, how can we deepen our engagement with local and regional audiences while raising the profile of the program? How far can we push the artistic program in terms of its breadth and ambition? What else can we learn through partnerships with other organizations that are embedded within our communities, but may not even necessarily be arts organizations? And how can we, as Tate St Ives, in our rural and remote context, take part in critical issues in the museum field? For example, the notion that we're all aware of around decolonizing collections, and further embracing multiple histories of art, or considering new forms of interpretation and encounter. And how can we meaningfully change the way in which audiences use our galleries as a space to explore and discuss ideas, review the degree to which Tate St Ives is proactive or responsive to audience needs and interests alongside its mission? So these are some of the key questions I think that we've been grappling with, and to sum it all up, because it's really important to remember that Tate St Ives is based around this modernist collection, and this is what the entire first building holds, alongside this new contemporary gallery that we can also use for modernist exhibitions, of course. We've already done an exhibition by Patrick Heron, and in January we're launching a major exhibition on Nam Gabo, the first in 30 years. So occasionally we will revisit modern artists, but this is essentially what we're talking about. What is really important also is that Tate St Ives is the only one of the 4 Tates where the collection relates to place. So if you think about it, Tate Liverpool, Tate Modern, Tate Britain, Tate Modern doesn't relate to London. That's not necessarily what the collection is doing. The collection is not skewed to represent that. But in Tate St Ives, it has to reflect that. And it's not to say that we can't bring a lot of other artists and counterpoints. There's work by many other artists, Carmen Herrera, Gego, Ligia Clark, because we want to show a lot of comparisons and contrasts with other global modernisms, for example. So we've tried to diversify the collection that's on show when we relaunched in 2017. But nonetheless, that is the key reason why we're there, and is the key reason people come. So given that, this is the programmatic vision that we developed when we launched in October 2017. And the first is around what I was just talking about, which is to celebrate but consistently reevaluate the key figures in the history of modernism in St Ives, situating them within broader art histories and introducing fresh perspectives on their work. Because I think the most deathly thing you could do is to have a beautiful collection, it's Tate collection primarily, and leave it there without change, without interrogation, without questioning for year after year after year. Because then you have a mausoleum, and then it's not really a living, breathing gallery. So it's a very active sense of revisiting modernism in the first one. And then the second is really about, it continues that actually, they're interrelated strand, they're not necessarily meant to be completely separate. But it's to apply the same spirit of internationalism, experimentation, and radicalism to a distinctive program of contemporary exhibitions, commissions, residencies, and displays. I think a lot of people forget now that Barbara Hepworth and Nam Gabo, Ben Nicholson, these were all radical artists in the late 30s coming to St Ives, which is largely landscape painting and traditional work. These are artists who were bringing the cutting edge of modernism to this small town. And there was a dramatic impact in terms of how they were received, and obviously what happened to St Ives after that. So it's thinking about how do we present some of the most exciting and interesting artists around the world today in this context, in a way continuing that legacy of kind of more experimental practice. And so, for example, these are some of the ways in which we can do it, which I've mentioned before, with someone like Nam Gabo, re-examining them from fresh perspectives, which we're doing in the following exhibition, profiling under-recognized figures in the history of modernism, especially global artists and movements, collaborating around scholarship, activating the collection and archives through multiple contemporary perspectives, not just from the visual arts, but from other fields. And then really thinking through how can you create conversations across these different buildings across these different generations and across these modern and contemporary. So just a few examples of how we've started to do that. When we had a major Patrick Heron exhibition, we also invited Rana Begum, a British Bangladeshi artist based in London, and her work is on the left and the right, and his is in the middle, to do what we call a Gallery 10 exhibition, which is a gallery that's more for emerging artists, actually, and it's more for experimental projects, because I think it's really important that we have that at Tate St Ives as well, as a kind of counterpart to the major exhibitions. And so she came and did a residency at Porthmeor Studios, and then produced this incredible installation of new work in Gallery 10 alongside Patrick Heron's exhibition. And, you know, it wasn't so literal that we commented on it. We didn't make a formal relationship when we talked about the exhibitions. But interestingly, it was something that the public did pick up on, that they recognized that this was a young artist working with light and form and color and abstraction in a way that was giving a different perspective to Patrick Heron. This is another example that just finished this summer. Ugaid Kaland, who sadly just passed away in the last month. An artist originally from Lebanon, who spent a long time in Paris and then Los Angeles before going back to Beirut. And she was an amazing figure who was quite largely overlooked and has been coming to prominence in the last few years. And she was working alongside many of the artists that are represented in the collection. So it was a way of introducing our audiences to an artist who was rising in importance with some really beautiful and outstanding works that would otherwise never be seen in Tate St Ives, or actually probably in Britain at the time that we showed it. And just making these available and as part of our exhibition program. So these are some of the examples in terms of exhibitions, and there's just a glimpse of that exhibition that we had in Tate of her work. Also the academic side, which, you know, coming from the background I did from particularly New Museum and Art in general, I think that's one thing I'm very conscious of, because we're not in a city, is how do you maintain intellectual rigor in a rural, remote location, where your artistic community is obviously a lot smaller than it is in a big city, and how do you make sure that you're a hub of intellectual activity? It cannot be exclusively that, but it has to have that. So one of the things we did was this Global Communities Curating Modern Art Today symposium, and you may or may not know these names, and in a way I hope you don't, because one of the goals was that alongside the axis of solidarity, which Tate Modern did in London, with a lot of very established speakers, we did a conference a little bit after that, where our role as Tate St Ives, the smallest of the four, actually decided that we would profile emerging writers and emerging curators and some of the freshest, youngest voices coming into the field. And it was really interesting, and I think that's very important to us, that we're part of this research hub for Tate, because Tate has the Hyundai Transnational Research Centre, and Tate St Ives is going to be part of that through the work that it does in this kind of ancillary way. But another example of how we're connecting in a greater way is that on November the 5th, Ottobong Nkanga and I are speaking at Tate Modern and launching a publication. And that has not happened, as far as I'm aware, in Tate St Ives' history, where we're actually starting to work across the sites in this way and contribute to larger Tate initiatives, which I think is really important, regardless of our geography. These are possibly a bit more light-hearted, but it still shows a kind of playful way in which we can revisit modernism through some of artist commissions. On the top left is a commission by Katie Schwab called This Interesting and Wonderful Factory. And this actually has extremely interesting history in St Ives, because the Crusade factory was a textile factory that of course is now closed, but it was largely run by women in the war. So mostly it was women workers, so it's the history of female labor. And Katie Schwab, a young artist who was based in Cornwall, was extremely interested in that and made it into this kind of environment. And the one on the right was the one we opened with, where It's called Six Pillars of Modernism, and it's a really tongue-in-cheek gesture to Barbara Hepworth and Ben Nicholson from a contemporary perspective of two very young artists who created this space for people to be in, but also a kind of backdrop for all of our events. And this is another example by Ella Frears, a young poet, where I think we're able to be quite bold because we are where we are, and we can actually conceive and execute a new form or experimental form of interpretation and just put it out in the gallery, where maybe if we were central it might take a few months of reviews and approvals, but we can actually just do it. And she did this beautiful poem on stringing the form as a kind of ode to Barbara Hepworth, and this is in the gallery, and you can make it into a paper plane and throw it around, and it's really brilliant. So there's ways in which we're intervening with the collection, intercepting different points in the collection displays with very new and surprising things. This just goes a little bit more into continuing the legacy, the other side of the strand, which is about championing global contemporary perspectives and actively involving artists in all aspects of programming, as I've also already been describing. And then this thing about resonance in art and society and relevance and currency in terms of, you know, kind of art, politics, culture, and how we do that in the region that we are. And part of that is, of course, acknowledging where we are and deepening relationships with those who already are there. So this year, really, in January, began what we call the kind of new program for Tate St Ives, which has the temporary exhibitions program, a newly imagined artist residency program, which in brief means that it can be an artist coming to do work for an exhibition, to create a performance. It can be a research into the archives. It can be a critique or an analysis of something that's already there. And there's a lot of performance that happens in the program. And again, that's something that's quite new. Collaboration and partnerships from local to international. We do have a publicly stated community strategy, which we need to have because of where we are. Learning and research strands, and also this new thing, which is an annual public art project, as we describe it with and for the town of St Ives, that has emerged in the last couple of years. And these are the exhibitions that we launched for 2019 and 2020, and the ones for 21 to 23 are currently in development. And, you know, there is a rationale about why we chose, you know, certain artists. You know, thinking about that vision for the gallery and the programmatic vision, there are things that you can see. I mean, Anna Barlow was a kind of magnificent start in a way because she is dealing with a lot of global issues. She's dealing with it through media. Painting and sculpture has a huge, strong tradition in Cornwall. She's an amazing researcher. She goes deep into everything that she sees and encounters, and she did the same with Cornwall and the history of Cornwall, the post-industrial landscape, which really relates to a lot of the other work that she's done, and looking at the rise of fascism, looking at the cycles of mistakes that humankind continue to make over and over and over again in these incredible works, which are huge sails coming from the ceiling. I'll show a few in a moment or two, down to some hundreds of kind of paper cutout figures where, you know, she's looking at humanity across different cultures, anything from the Roman times onwards. So this is an artist who works across time and space and histories in the most incredible way. And she also looked at ideas around exile, and you can actually relate that, of course, back to the reason why the Modern Art St Ives display is there in the first place, because mostly it was from artists who came in exile from the Second World War to England first and then to St Ives. So there's lots of ways you can look across the program that might not immediately be apparent, but if you dig deeper, these different ties are there. So here she is, Anna Barlow, and this is the way that the gallery was transformed. And we worked with the Castello di Rivoli, and then Anna, being Anna, decided that she wanted to do something as well, different, and she made a new commission based on her research. And these are some of the things that we showed in the exhibition. This is the new commission that she made. She made this, a tin drum that has lost its rhythm, and it essentially was looking at Cornwall as a post-industrial society that was mainly now relying on tourism. and what does that mean for culture and society in Cornwall. She was deeply interested in that and carried a lot of research out. And these are just a couple of other works just to give you an idea of that show and how we use the galleries. And this is the sale I was talking about earlier, where on one side you have kind of chemical compound diagrams, and on the other they have this incredible map of the world. Okay, so let's see. I wanted to briefly touch on the responsive programming that we have. So once an exhibition is up, we try and develop a whole number of programs around it that will either interrogate it, celebrate it, take something else and make something new out of it. So one of the things that we did around the Virginia Woolf exhibition, we commissioned Jonathan Baldock and Florence Peake to do some rather incredible performances. And you can see definitely on the left that Jonathan Baldock is referring to Barbara Hepworth, but in a very interesting way. And then Florence Peake is doing an incredibly interesting performance on the ground in response to a lot of ideas in the Virginia Woolf exhibition and around feminism. So I think these kinds of projects probably didn't happen in the last few years in St Ives, because it was largely revolving around the modernist legacy. But this was a wonderful project. We have a young people's program, and we also have a partnership with Falmouth University. So there's a lot of young artists in Cornwall coming through this program. And when Rosalind Nashashibi and Lucy Scare did their really interesting exhibition around the legacy of Gauguin and the male gaze, this amazing group of young women created their own film around Why Wouldn't I Be Angry, which was quite an extraordinary thing. So there's a lot of creation of new work that happens in response to the exhibitions that is then also publicly presented. So this was publicly presented as a program. And similarly, there's a small but important LGBTQ+ community in Cornwall, and Tate St Ives is one of the few spaces where they feel able and safe to come. So the bottom one here is one of the programs that they did. Another performance above, and then the Young People's Program also developed a performance in response to Anna Bouyguian's exhibition. One of the nicest new programs that we created was something called The Last Weekend, where we held back, if you like, from responding fully or pre-planning everything. And The Last Weekend is a accumulation of responses to the exhibition by multiple parties. So we had a group of musicians come in that did a new kind of, a song or a composition in response to it. Amazingly, our volunteers and our visitor experience staff, so essentially the tour guides, the people that you would meet on the floor, decided that they wanted to learn and rehearse and then perform to the public Tagore's play, The Post Office. So that's also what happened on The Last Weekend. So many, many things arose in a 2-day series of events that was really looking back at the 3 months of Anna Bouyguian's show in new ways. Otobong Nakanga just opened in September, and we were really thrilled to invite her here to St Ives, and she deals a lot with ideas that are incredibly relevant to Cornwall. She is dealing with ideas of extraction and what humankind has done to the land over many, many years. And I'm just going to show you a selection of works from that exhibition, which clearly have relevance for Cornwall, despite the fact that she's mainly looking at mining in places like Namibia. There's a kind of universality of kind of cause and effect that she's looking at, and ideas about consequences on the environment, and whether or not we're aware of when a young girl might put eyeshadow on, where that mica in that makeup has actually come from. So there are a lot of really provocative and interesting programs we're developing now around Otobong's show that are involving many age groups, many, many different kinds of audiences. And this is, the piece is called From Where I Stand, The Carpet. So it's really clearly talking about taking a position. And this is part of a new wall drawing that she created for the whole of the back wall in Tate St Ives. This is a piece called Solid Manoeuvres, which if you fly above Cornwall and you see the clay pits that have been gouged out of the land, these are some kind of the visual imagery of that really resonates with you. And these are some of her earlier drawings. just to give a sense of the exhibition. And then there's a video. Let's see. Some of her other research. We chose to show a lot of her photographs for the first time that she'd previously seen just as research photographs, but for this exhibition she actually made them into works of art. And the other thing about Tate St Ives is that, of course, you know, artists necessarily bring with them their own interests in areas of research. And Ottobong had an enormous interest in oral histories and the fact that we have bards in Cornwall. And these are like people who were involved in, the bard is a kind of person who looks after particular things. So there's a bard of the sea, there's a bard of the archive. So it's almost like a kind of sacred holding of natural elements or histories. And this really resonated with Ottobong's practice. So sometimes it goes the other way around. You know, an artist might bring something, but also Cornwall brings something to her that she hasn't necessarily had. And she incorporated, the two people at the back are both, they're bards. And they took part in the performance that happened down by the sea and then came back into the gallery to be installed. So responding to the environment where we're in is not a prerequisite of inviting someone to Tate St Ives, but necessarily a lot of artists do get inspired by it or bring some elements in a particular way. And you can see the sculpture there that was then hung as after a special performance coming back into the gallery. I just want to touch on finally the annual public art project that happened in 2018. This was a pilot project with the artist called Lucy Joyce, and it's political with a small p possibly, because St Ives is a town where it goes very dark in winter, and not just weather-wise, but literally, because most of the town is owned by people outside St Ives, mostly by people from London and other places, or that rent it out as holiday lets. So this really kind of glamorous view of the town in the summertime with loads of people coming, and it's all buzzing, and it's almost too busy, and people can hardly cope with the traffic. When those people go away again, when the tourists go away, you're left with what St Ives really is. And I think Lucy Joyce was interested in what St Ives really is in the dark months of the winter. And so it was quite a simple notion in a way, but as I say, subliminally political, because she asked them to display these huge neon circles outside their window just for a day. And then we had aerial photography document, in a way, who were actually the real live residents of the town and where they were. So it also was a kind of mapping of the town in a particular way. Moving into the one we did for this year, this is by, the one on the right, is by a Dutch artist living in New York called Allard van Hoorn. And the picture at the bottom you see is the mayor of St Ives, and there's a 1,000-year-old tradition of what they call hurling the silver ball. So the mayor will throw out a silver ball, and young people will fight for it, and then there's some kind of award at the end for this. But it's a really ancient tradition. Cornwall has a lot of ancient traditions that have not yet, you know, been killed off or not yet died out. And he was really interested in this, but decided that what he wanted was to make a 2-meter version of it that would then be choreographed by the town itself. So I hope this map is clear. But basically where the number 1 is, this was a Panbeagle housing estate in St Ives. And essentially, he worked with the communities for several months, did a couple of site visits and worked with our staff to develop this. We basically choreographed the town and choreographed it with the town. So he worked with different communities, and they all had to be persuaded to be involved. You know, like it was an open opportunity. There was an invitation, a lot of discussion, a lot of changing of minds through the process. So this is a project which really went through a rigorous community consultation, but actually ended up all the better for it, I think, because it really was a huge success. So what happened was that for a couple of hours in the summer, this ball just basically did a kind of sonic mapping of the town and was rolled around by different communities, almost like a kind of passing of the baton, Olympic baton, right over the beach and right into the Tate. And Allard had recorded all these different sounds inside the ball as it was moving around, and then performed it back again into the loggia. And then we showed the film the aerial footage of this event in our gallery afterwards. So it was a really interesting way of bringing people back in. So this is a kind of surprising, possibly, but natural and interesting new addition in that Tate St Ives being where it is, it kind of necessarily needs to get out of the building. You know, we have the beach, we have all of the beaches, we have this incredible landscape, we have the town that we're in, so we don't feel we can just stay inside the building and expect people to come. So this is kind of a new avenue of experimental projects that we've been undertaking. And I think looking ahead, just to finish, now that we've established this kind of program, it's thinking about how can we continue to build on it, but also how can we kind of shake it up a little. So, you know, bringing in new dimensions. One of the things we dream about is working with other institutions in Cornwall to possibly develop to like a 2-year project that's like a theatrical production or an operatic production with a visual artist who wants to work in that way, maybe using local manufacturers in the creation of stage sets, all these different things that we could do. Using the gallery, Tate Modern has this amazing series of performance. And we have been thinking about, do we always have to just do exhibitions, but can we use that large space to maybe host one of the Tate performances as part of the collection? Or can we work with Tate Modern to possibly partner on part of the program that would then come there? So there's like a lot of possibilities there. This idea of co-production, this is I would say in the museum sector, this is probably a very contested area where it's questioning, goes back to that CMAM question of to what degree do you, you know, how far do you go with the co-production in terms of, you know, communities co-curating a space in your gallery, co-curating a project. I think that's something that we're interested in looking into further, but in a kind of serious way. And then actively partnering with other people on residencies, critical debate, publishing and research. So there's a lot of aspects of Tate St Ives that can continue to develop. And there's one thing that's not here yet, may never be, but it's a space we have that is Barbara Hepworth's second studio called the Palais de Danse. And this is a site that belongs to Tate. What happens with it is not yet known. It will be at some point debated, and there will be a plan for it. But right now, it's ours, and it's there. And this is a space which has a sprung floor. So that space that you see has a sprung floor. It was a theatre. It was a movie theatre. It was Barbara Hepworth's second studio. You can see her sculptures. But it is the most extraordinary space for performance and for sculpture and for residency. So that is another potential third space that we might have in the town that would allow artistic possibilities that we can't even dream about yet. So I think that kind of is almost like a fantasy project, but it is possible that at some point that might happen. So hopefully that gives you a flavor of how we've been developing it in the last couple of years as a team, and just maybe a sense of where it might go in the future. But I'd be happy to answer any questions that any of you may have about it.
Now it's time for questions.
A very easy question,
Yeah.
a very short one. How big is your team?
With all of the staff, depending on absences, if you like, or maternity leave and things like that are normal, at any moment there's between kind of 40 and 50. That's about the size of the team, but that's every department. So marketing, operations, visitor experience, learning, curatorial. Curatorial, there's 3. So there's myself and 2 others. There's 1, 2, 3, like 3, the equivalent of 3 or 4 full-time people in learning, but a lot of part-time people. So the creative team is actually quite small. The larger teams are in operations and in visitor experience. They're the largest departments of all. And if you add the casuals and the part-times and the volunteers, it's around 240 people. So that's where it gets quite large.
I just wonder, how big is your audience?
Okay, how big is the audience? So last year we just had 300,000 people come.
Okay, and where are they from?
They're from around the world. So in what we call the shoulder seasons around the summer, I would say they're largely regional and national. But we're seeing an increasing number of international specialist trips come. So from America, from within the UK, possibly from Asia, because next year is the 100th anniversary of Bernard Leach and Shoji Hamada. So there's a lot of interest from Japanese museums right now in being there and taking groups to St Ives. So in those off seasons, if you like, there's more of a serious art group of people coming now than I think used to happen before. And in the summer, there's a lot of tourists, and they come from Britain and from all over the world. So we have huge, hugely detailed kind of demographics that you can look through for it. But it's
and what is the size of the population?
It's around, depending on where you see the perimeter of the town, kind of between 8,000 and 11,000. 11,000 is often there.
And you have got 300,000 visitors.
Yes.
Great.
Yes. So it is. It's quite a lot for the town to absorb. Yeah. So it's quite a lot.
Okay, and one more question. Forgive me my ignorance, but why the decision was made by the Tate to actually have, a Tate there?
So there was a lot of interest in, I think, by Tate, director, Tate staff, in having something in Cornwall that marked the significance of Barbara Hepworth, Ben Nicholson and Gabo being there. But because they were not the only generation, there were many subsequent generations. So the generation of, Patrick Heron, Sandra Blow, there's like many, many other artists who then went to St Ives and lived there and produced really a lot of work. So St Ives had its 50s period, 60s period. It wasn't just the 30s and 40s. And it continues today with a lot of living artists. So it's a real artistic community still. I really feel that when I'm living in the town, because I live right in the town, is that you're surrounded by artists as well as by, if you like, your general public or your community.
Or cows.
Your cows. That's right, yes. But that was the reason it was established, and Tate worked with Cornwall Council to make that happen. So effectively, there was a lot of consultation. There was this thing called the STAG group, which was the group that lobbied very hard for the Tate to come into existence in Cornwall. And so by 1993 it happened. So,
are there any measurements on economical impact of the gallery in the city?
Yeah, so the figures, the most recent figures, and there may well be more up-to-date ones, is that it brings £11 million into the economy, which is a lot. So into the larger economy, because of all the accommodation, the travel, the taxis, the flights, the trains. It's a huge part of that industry,
I don't want to domineer the...
No.
Any other questions? Please, it's a special occasion. If you feel more comfortable to ask them in Polish, it's okay, we'll translate. So I have a question on how is your relationship with the local community today? Yeah, because you were talking about very interesting tools that Tate St Ives and you yourself with your team were like implementing to get the local community engage or to make them feel that it's like their place. Yeah. So how do you feel, how is it today in terms of, I don't know, the membership programs or the local press or the educational programs? How do you feel that this relationship looks like today? Yeah,
it's very good. It's very good today. I mean, I think we have an official partnership with Falmouth University and the School of Art. So now we work in collaboration. So all of those young artists going through these programs, they now have an official relationship with Tate, and that does not happen before. That was instigated last year. So they not only come for career development or programs, they also take part in the program, and they curate and they produce programs and then do them in public. So there's a whole outlet then as young artists that gives them that opportunity. With what happened, of course, with things like the Heritage Lottery Fund and all the big grants for the capital project, often what happens is that as you open, they go away because there have been 3-year grants or 5-year grants. So we were left with a smaller staff. So we're constantly looking at how we, deliver, if you like, programming as effectively as possible. So that's always something that is in play. But I think the relationships have only strengthened, actually, because they're being maintained and they're being nurtured. And the public response to these exhibitions, because in all honesty, it was a risk, because many people might say, well, unless you show the St Ives artist, or unless you show a very famous name that, I mean, not Picasso, but you know what I mean, like somebody with a real name recognition to a very, very broad public, then no one's going to come. And in fact, that's not what we've seen. So by selecting the artists that we have, and they have had an impact on the audiences that have come, whether they're art audiences or not. So if you look at the visitor comments and you read them, it's really heartening, actually, because the response has been very positive to those exhibitions, and they've been quite different. Anna Begin is very different from Uget, and that's very different from Ottobong, and Haegu Yang's project next year is going to be incredibly architectural and amazingly bold. So, with each one, it's really going to shift your perception of the gallery. But I think they're actually, from what I can see, embracing that now. And there's kind of an excitement about what might come next. Maybe an acknowledgement they might not like it, but that they're interested enough to try, and that they're coming. And I think I think there's kind of like a stronger interest by the artistic community as well, which is important to us. So,
in terms of strategy, how to attract the local community to actually, come and participate, what would be your golden 3 bullet points or 5 bullet points?
So one of the things that we did do when we opened is we introduced a locals pass. So if you can prove that you're a resident of Cornwall, you can have, instead of Tate admission, you can pay £5, and for that £5 you can come as many times as you want in a year. And so that's less than half the price of a normal ticket. So that's really geared to our very local audiences, very regional audiences. The challenge we have is that for other parts of Cornwall, it's not that accessible and it's not that close. So your ticket might be £5, but the train might be £12.50. So that's the community, if you like, that's the group of audiences that are still the most challenging, because it's not our ticket price necessarily, it's the price of transport or how to get there or the number of hours it takes to get there. So there's lots of real challenges there. But I think one of the goals is to reach as many young people as possible in that region. So we've been really strengthening our young people's programming. We also have a lot of groups that are not in that category. We have a very lively number of groups called the Look groups, and they're based around the group book model, where people would gather together and read books and talk about them. So this is a group of not necessarily older generation, but those who are able to meet and do that on a regular basis, and they're called the Look groups, and they do that as well. Now they're self-sustaining and self-organizing, so they just use us as a resource now and a meeting place. But before, we would do a lot of outreach. So in a way, it's seeing which of those can start to actually use it on their own, and which groups of people you need to keep having a much more sustained dialogue with. So, I mean, we would like to raise that number by another 50,000 in 5 years' time, but that's a lot of challenge in doing that because of our geography, partly.
Okay, so Tate St Ives has a very particular relationship with the local community, and I think so far it's proven to be a very good thing. I was curious, what's your opinion on other galleries or museums or even other Tates having a similar approach to the local community? Is it even possible? And if so, how do you think that should come to be?
I think it is possible. They would need to do it in different ways. So Liverpool is maybe the closest parallel to us, although not in a geographic sense and not in a sense of being rural. But they do, they're kind of in Liverpool. They had a history of having a really good community and outreach program, and I think that's something they definitely want to build on. The new director there, Helen Legg, I think is focusing much more on the history of Liverpool and its significance beyond, its own self, if you like. And so the program is beginning to shift there to bring different kinds of work and different kinds of artists. And it might be that other Tates introduce the Locals Pass, I'm not sure. But London had an amazing program, you might have heard of it, called Tate Exchange, which was a program where different groups, different communities, different organizations took over one of the floors in Tate Modern, and it was programmed by different groups every time. So in a way, that's a much larger version of what we might do in one of our spaces in Tate St Ives, and we simply don't have the resources to do that. But what we do in our own programming is like a microcosm of that. So some of the other programs in the other Tates are much more advanced because they're bigger and they have more resources. But I'm interested to see how they develop that also, and when thinking about local in the future.
Anybody else?
Why not? Why not?
Yeah, it's true. You read my thoughts. But I didn't have time to formulate it as a question, really, so I hope it sounds like a question. I thought that one of the things you want to do in the future is to have this 2-year long engagement with like long-term projects. I was thinking that that's something that we recently did here, so because it's more focused maybe on process than obviously on production, but for 2 years you are focused on process and also on engagement with the local audience, etc. But it's not something very usual to see in large institutions. They normally have a very production-focused program, like 3 months or 4 months, and then move on to the next project. So there are not many references out there. I was wondering, I guess it's 2 questions. One is if you are already working on that strand of the program and you already have some ideas or some artists that you're already specifically thinking of. And then the second question is what have been your models? I mean, at that institutional level, like if you are inspired by previous experiences, because again, I can think of very few. So I was wondering if you had been, I don't know, thinking of specifically of other institutional experiences like that.
2 very good questions. So the first one, I suppose myself and the team, we have kind of thoughts and ideas about maybe a few individual artists who are interested in working in that way, either with theatre or opera. There's a place called Hall for Cornwall, which is about to reopen. So for example, there are potential partners out there that we could work with. They're not open, so we can't approach them now, but places like that we could speak to about could they be interested in doing that. There's an enormous interest in using public space, I think, and we're really seeing a hunger for that now. So it might be a performance that happens in Tate St Ives, it might be in a theatre space like that, or it might be in both. It might be on the beach, on the cliff, it could be anywhere. So depending on what that artist has in mind, I think the fact that you're doing something and it's taking a while and there's a process involved, I think actually people find really interesting. And because in a way your community is, your core community is relatively static, they will see that process through. And that's something that we're seeing that they're really intrigued by and interested in. And that wasn't necessarily something you can expect before you go and live there. I'm used to working from art in general in long-term commissioning projects, doing multiple projects at a time. So you're beginning one with one artist and someone else's is about to come to an end, and there's another 2-year process with somebody else. So partly it's coming out of my past experience. And I would say that those kinds of ways of working are coming out of my time probably at the New Museum, formerly the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, and also art in general. But probably more through the kinds of organizations that we worked with as a really small nonprofit. And so the organizations that I admired, of course this was one of them, but also before, you know, we worked with CCA between 2009 to 12. Now we have a new relationship, which is fantastic. But we were working with organizations, you know, really small ones like Constella Lisbon, Beirut and Cairo, a number of organizations that were just doing really experimental and interesting programs. And then I think we sparked off each other in terms of how you can exist and work. And we spent a long time talking about how you can best support artists when you're not necessarily a big institution. And weirdly now, I'm part of a big institution. So in a way, probably what I'm trying to do is bring the flexibility and the responsiveness of a tiny non-profit to a place like Tate St Ives and see what's possible. And the beauty of it is that more is possible than I thought. Tate is a very big institution, but because we are the little one and we're remote and all the rest of it, our turnaround can actually be faster. And also we are the only one with a residency program, and I think that's really special. So we can invite artists at any stage of their career, and that also includes emerging artists. So that part of like professional life and interests and the desire to support artists at an earlier stage, if you like, doesn't have to disappear now that, you know, I'm at Tate. So it's a personal answer to your question maybe, but I think it's thinking through how can you obviously give someone like Anna Bouyguian a platform, or Ugaid Caland, more recognized, well-known artists, alongside someone like Rana, you know, or who is becoming more known, but is not necessarily at that international level of recognition, but can come through a residency and do an absolutely beautiful project. And I'd like to invite more artists to look at, you know, Barbara Hepworth's studio and interrogate that a little bit in terms of its a kind of like a beautiful modern myth now. It's an incredible place, but there's a lot around that could be investigated. There's huge potential for artists to do research in Tate Archive, for example, and in the history of the town. There are lots of other stories that, in working in collaboration with community, for example, there's a huge interest in unearthing the queer narratives of St Ives, just to give another example. And that's never been shown at Tate, that's never been encountered. So how might we show those kinds of histories through collaborating on a display or a presentation or an exhibition? There's multiple ways to do that. And many artists are interested in actually those kinds of projects. So that is another way that we would work. So not just necessarily through exhibition only.
Okay, any other question? Okay.
I want to ask you, maybe not very wise question, but do you see any possibilities to influence your activity by the politics and just by the Brexit? I wonder if you see any possible influence and effects of political situation in your institutional activity?
Just thinking about how best to answer that one. I mean, I guess like all of Tate, we're committed to showing what we feel is some of the most interesting and important art from around the world. And in that statement is a statement about remaining committed to that, you know, whether we're in Europe or not. So I think that's something that we feel quite... Yes, sorry. Yes, yes, I know. No, I'm already getting sad about my passport. It's fine. Yes, I was just thinking it's a very good thing I'm going back on the 31st of October and not the 1st of November. But, you know, that's that. I think, you know, it's really about also offering a platform to artists who may have many, many different political opinions, if you like, and many things to say. As an institution, you know, it's probably, I mean, it's like non-profits in the States. They're not actually able to take a political position, but they're able to offer a platform for artists to have an opinion or express views on any topic. And that is the beauty of it, if you like. It is a container, it is a space for discussion and debate. And that essentially is the role that we can continue to play. You know, within the context of the changing politics around us. I mean, even in Anna Bourguien's show, I think there were a lot of topics that came out of that exhibition that looked a lot at the subject matter of Brexit, whether it's borders, whether it's mobility, all of those things. So even in looking at an exhibition like that, you can actually talk about some really difficult subjects. And in fact, that is the subject that the young people chose to talk about. So when they did a in-focus research program and then a presentation, they actually were the ones that were really quite outspoken about what it meant to them, because they're young now and they're entering this period where Britain will not be part of the EU. It looks like for much longer. So what does that mean for them as young people? What does that mean for their mobility? So they were really publicly talking about it. So I think those are the ways that you can have a space and you can provide a platform for those kinds of debates, and probably that's what we see as being important. So I hope that answers your question. I don't know, as much as one can, yes.
Okay, anybody wants to ask a question or more questions? No? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very inspiring conversation, yeah, and thank you very much, Anne, for this presentation, for being with us today. Thank you, Eva, for supporting this this meeting. And what can I say? I could, because I was lucky enough to visit Tate St Ives this year, and what I could do is really to encourage you, once you are in Great Britain, be that Great Britain still a part of EU or not, yes. to really make this effort of going to Cornwall, to going to St Ives and visiting Tate, because it's really worth. It's really rewarding the effort of the trip. So yeah, thank you very much, all of you, for being with us this evening.